Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Understanding Ethics. So far in this series, we've explored three important ideas. First, we asked, what is ethics? Then we looked at several major ethical frameworks different philosophies use that help explain what people value. Finally, we explored different decision making lenses, showing that even people with similar values may apply those values differently. Today, we're going to make everything much more practical. So instead of studying philosophical schools of thought, we're going to learn 8 simple questions. These questions won't magically solve every moral dilemma, but they will help you to think more completely. One of the biggest reasons people make poor ethical decisions isn't because they're evil or unintelligent, it's because they're only asking one or two questions. Ethics becomes much richer and usually much wiser when we learn to ask several questions instead. So imagine you've been asked to make a difficult decision at work. Perhaps a coworker has made a serious mistake. Reporting it could cost them their job. Ignoring it could allow future harm. So, what's the right thing to do? Many people immediately jump to an answer, but ethical thinkers usually slow down. Instead of rushing towards conclusions, they begin asking better questions. Today, we'll examine 8 of those questions. Each highlights an important ethical value, but none of them tells the entire story. Only together they can provide a much fuller picture. The first question asks, how can I act in a way that balances competing interests and treat relevant differences appropriately? You see, fairness is often confused with equality, but they're not always the same thing. Treating everyone identically isn't always fair. Imagine a classroom. One student has perfect vision, another is visually impaired. Giving both students the exact same printed worksheet is equal. Providing one student with enlarged print may actually be more fair. Fairness asks us to consider what differences genuinely matter and which differences should never matter. It challenges favoritism, bias, and prejudice and arbitrary treatment. A helpful question is, am I applying the same standards to similar situations? Our second question is related to outcomes. It asks, what action produces the best short-term and long-term results for those affected? Sometimes called consequential thinking, this approach asks us to consider the ripple effects of our decisions. Who benefits? Who is harmed? What happens next week, or next year, or 10 years from now? For example, a city may decide whether to remove an aging bridge. Closing it immediately inconveniences thousands of commuters. Leaving it open risks catastrophic failure later. Good ethical thinking considers both immediate and future consequences. One important reminder, consequences matter, but predicting consequences is often difficult. And that's why this question should rarely stand alone. Our third question is about responsibilities. We ask, what obligations, duties, or commitments apply in this situation? Every role carries responsibilities. Parents have responsibilities to their children, teachers to their students, doctors to their patients, and so on with friends, employers, and citizens. Even promises create responsibilities. Sometimes, doing the ethical thing isn't about what we want. It's about honoring commitments we've already made. Imagine finding a lost wallet. No one's watching. Keeping it may have positive consequences for you. Returning it fulfills a responsibility towards another person. Responsibility asks, what have I committed myself to? And what obligations exist because of the role I occupy? Our fourth question shifts towards character. Instead of asking, what should I do? Character asks, what action best reflects the kind of person I want to become? Every decision shapes us, not dramatically, usually, but gradually. Habits become character. Character becomes our reputation, and reputation is what develops trust between other people. Imagine no one would ever discover your decision. What would you choose? Would you still be proud of that choice? Character asks us to think beyond isolated actions. It asks who we're becoming one decision at a time. Thinking about traits like honesty, humility, courage, patience, integrity, or compassion. These aren't just simple behaviors. They're qualities we cultivate over a lifetime. Our fifth question is around liberty. How should freedom, autonomy, and consent be respected or limited in this situation? Freedom is one of humanity's most cherished values. People generally want the ability to make their own choices, but freedom often exists alongside responsibility. Should people always be free to make their own decisions? What if those decisions seriously harm others? Should governments require seatbelts? Should businesses regulate dangerous products? Should parents override children's choices? Liberty asks us to carefully examine where freedom begins and where it ends, and when limiting freedom may or may not be ethically justified. It reminds us that respecting autonomy is itself a deeply important moral value. Our sixth question is around empathy. This is perhaps the most human question. What would I choose if I deeply understood and cared about the experiences of everyone involved? Empathy asks us to step outside ourselves, to imagine, to listen, to understand. Notice something important. Empathy is not simply agreement. You can deeply understand someone's experience without agreeing with every decision they make. Ethically, empathy expands our perspectives. It helps us to notice suffering we might otherwise overlook. It challenges us to remember that every decision affects real people and not just abstract ideas. A useful exercise is simply asking, how might this decision feel from someone else's perspective? Sometimes that single question completely changes the conversation. Our seventh question is around authority. What do legitimate sources of authority require or recommend? Sometimes this is also with respect to laws or expertise, tradition, or faith. Authority sometimes receives a bad reputation, but societies depend on legitimate authority. There's professional standards in careers, scientific expertise, various religious traditions or institutional policies, or historical wisdom. These often exist because generations of people have wrestled with difficult questions before us. Authority asks, what can I learn from those who have experience, expertise, or legitimate responsibility? But ethical thinking also asks an important follow-up. Is this authority legitimate? Is it trustworthy? Is it acting ethically itself? History reminds us that authority deserves respect, but never blind obedience. Good ethics balances humility with critical thinking. And our final question 8, is about rights. It asks what rights are involved and how should they be protected. Rights may be legal, constitutional, human, moral, or simply understood as fundamental protections owed to every person. Examples of this include the freedom of speech, privacy, respect of property, religious liberty, due process, equal treatment, and human dignity. Rights remind us that some interests deserve protection regardless of popularity, even if violating someone's rights would produce beneficial outcomes. Many ethical systems argue those rights should remain protected. Rights establish moral boundaries. They remind us that people are not merely tools for achieving desirable outcomes. Let's return to our workplace example. A coworker made a serious mistake. How might these 8 questions guide us? Fairness would ask, am I treating everyone consistently? Outcomes would ask, what happens if I report it? And what happens if I don't? Responsibilities might ask, what duties come with my professional role? Character asks, what decisions reflect integrity? Or liberty asks, whose autonomy is affected? An empathy approach asks how each person will experience this decision. Authority would ask, what do company policies, professional ethics, or the law require? And a rights-based approach would ask, whose rights deserve protection? Notice something remarkable. None of these questions alone necessarily provide the answer, but together they dramatically improve the quality of our thinking. You may have noticed something already. Different people naturally prioritize different questions. One person begins with rights, another with empathy. Someone else starts with consequences, and another starts with responsibility. This explains many ethical disagreements. People often aren't arguing over, these questions because they're ignoring ethics. They're emphasizing a different part of ethics. The conversation becomes far more productive once we recognize that. Instead of arguing over conclusions, we begin discussing which questions deserve greater weight. That's a much deeper and usually more respectful conversation. You don't need to be a philosopher to use these ideas. Before making an important decision, simply pause and ask yourself, is this fair? What outcomes am I creating? What responsibilities do I have? What does this say about my character? Does this respect people's freedom? Have I truly understood others' experiences? What guidance comes from legitimate authority? Or what rights need protection? You won't always find easy answers, and ethics rarely offers perfect certainty. But asking better questions almost always leads to better decisions. As this series continues, we're going to begin exploring many of these values individually. We'll examine where they come from and why thoughtful people prioritize them differently, how they complement one another, and why they sometimes collide in fascinating ways. You'll also begin recognizing these questions throughout the Council of Algorithms debates. One council member may argue almost entirely from rights, another from empathy, and someone else from outcomes, and yet another with fairness in mind. Once you recognize the questions that each member is asking, their reasoning becomes much easier to understand. Ethics isn't about finding one question that solves every dilemma. It's about learning to ask questions, and enough good questions, that we can see the full picture. The best ethical thinkers aren't those with the quickest answers. They're often the ones willing to slow down, consider competing values, and remain open to perspectives that they hadn't previously considered. The next time you face a difficult decision, don't ask only, what's the right answer? Instead ask, what questions haven't I considered yet? Because sometimes Wisdom doesn't begin with certainty, it begins with curiosity. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember that with perspective comes understanding. Thank you.